Daphne Johnston, and I am the director of the Respite Ministry here at First United Methodist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. A little over 9 years ago, our church had the vision that we wanted to provide a respite ministry for the Alzheimer's community, for care partners who could leave their loved ones with a team of volunteers. We wanted to pack 2 days a week from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock, full of activities, art, music, service projects. We recognized that people living with memory loss, they still wanted to give back to their community. They wanted to work and help. So we would pack these days with all this activity, but also new relationships. We wanted to form new memories and new friends. Our respite ministry became so successful. We started with 2 participants and 14 volunteers. We quickly grew to 3 days a week. And now fast forward 9 years, pre-COVID, we have 120 volunteers, 70 families in our program here locally, and we were serving 25 to 30 participants a day with 15 to 20 volunteers a day. And here's the catch: 1 paid person. This is a community effort. And we wanted to share this faith-based model with the entire world because we think there needs to be a respite ministry in every city in America and around the world. So I was fortunate enough to be invited to go to Australia this past fall. Right before I left, I had published my book. Who publishes a book post-COVID? But I published it, and it's got a blueprint of how you begin a respite ministry in your own community and the mindset, how you attract people to it. I go down to Australia to go present the model, and I come across Dr. Stephen Sabat. He just floored me with the information that was so relatable, his life's work on Alzheimer's and dementia. His thoughts and his work related to everything we were doing in our volunteer ministry. I wanted to spread his message, and therefore we partnered the Respite Ministry with our Respite for All Foundation. We formed the foundation to spread our respite model around the country last year. We want to share his message of new memories, of how care partners need to be aware of things. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce him with his biography. So wait 1 second, Doc, I got to read this about you. I couldn't memorize all of this. He has been at Georgetown for his whole career. He earned his doctorate at the City University of New York, where he specialized in neuropsychology. The main focus of his research has been the intact cognitive and social abilities of people with Alzheimer's in the moderate to severe stages of the disease. He also spotlights ways in which communication between those diagnosed and their care partners can be enhanced. We wanted this message spread because here again, this dovetails in to our daily ministry. And I hope that if you've got any questions on how you could begin a volunteer ministry in your community, you'll see my contact information at the end. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Stephen Sabat.
Oh, thanks very much, Daphne. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I really appreciate your energy and commitment because it's exactly what's needed in this world for dealing with people who are trying in one way or another to live with dementia of any kind, or Alzheimer's especially, but any kind of dementia is really important that people in the community understand how to maximize the strengths that people have, because we need to use our strengths rather than looking only at our weaknesses. So, but thank you very much, Daphne, for all of your hard work and conscientious efforts. You are a beacon of light. Before I get into this presentation, which you kind of see next to my face there, Forget Memory Loss, let me tell you a bit about myself and my background. About 40 years ago, I started going up to Johns Hopkins Hospital 1 day a week to administer neuropsychological tests to people with dementia in their Alzheimer's and dementia outpatient clinic. They were doing all kinds of drug studies there, and they needed to have someone to administer tests that would be used as ways of seeing if the drugs work or not. And so I was a person who was giving the tests to people before they started the program, and when they began taking drugs, and then in the middle of it, and at the end. And I spent about a year and a half doing that, and learned some things about people who have dementia. And what always struck me about it was that here are these people in a hospital, in a hospital clinic. It's an outpatient clinic, but still it's a hospital. And I don't know about all of you, but I, for example, don't particularly enjoy being around hospitals. And so many people, including me, when they go into even a doctor's office, but especially in a hospital, have something called white coat syndrome, meaning that, for example, you get nervous. And I have a very dear friend who's been a physician forever. He gets white coat syndrome when he goes to see his physician. And that means your blood pressure goes up, or you get nervous about this or that. But anyway, having people, testing people in a clinic like that is a snapshot. It's a snapshot of what they can do under certain circumstances, especially when they're nervous. So I thought it would really be a good idea if I could meet people in the everyday world where they live, and the everyday world is not a hospital clinic. And so I began going to an adult day center here in suburban Washington, DC. And I spent every day for a year at this adult day center, meeting people. I wasn't there as Professor Sabat or Dr. Sabat or anything like that. I was there as part of that community. And I would help feed people, take men to the restroom, help serve meals, clean up, participate in group programs. And all the while I was engaging with people who had all kinds of different types of brain damage. And I was learning from them. They became my teachers. And I've always thought that if I want to know something about dementia, it's really important to spend time with somebody who has it. As I used to say to people, well, you, in one case, you have Alzheimer's disease and I don't. You know what it's like and I don't. So I need you to help teach me what it's like. And so that began for the last 40 years, really, of research and writing and teaching and so on. And so that's where I'm coming from. And a good deal of what I learned and what you'll hear about in this presentation comes from circumstances that I encountered. And there are other things that I'll tell you about that come from laboratory experiments that people have conducted. And I'll tell you all about those. But if you look at the title of this presentation, it says, forget memory loss. People with Alzheimer's disease, and you could say dementia in general, can make new memories. Now, the thing is, you hear this term memory loss all the time. And what I'm here to do is to have you think about this and learn that maybe we shouldn't use that term at all because of the following. Why is the term memory loss used? Well, to answer that question, well, people repeatedly ask the same questions and have those questions answered already, and they'll just keep on asking the same question even though it's been answered. Or people, or for example, people fail to recall the names of their loved ones or the name of their relationships to them, or the special dates in the family's history, or having met someone a few minutes ago. This actually happened to me at the day center once. I walked in, I was supposed to meet a particular participant, and I walk in and I see this man that I've never met before, and I chatting with him for a few minutes. We have 3 or 4 minutes. We're having a nice, pleasant chat, and then I excused myself and went to the social worker's office to find her because she was going to introduce me to the person she wanted me to meet. And so I did that, and the social worker and I chatted for a few minutes, and then she said, well, let's go find Dr. B, and then you hear about him later. And so we go into the hall, and she looks to the left, and she says, oh, there he is. Now she's saying there he is, and he is the guy I just spent time speaking with. And she calls him over and says, have you met Dr. Sabat? And I'm about to say, well, yeah, we were just talking, but I held my tongue because she wasn't asking me the question, she was asking him. And so I let him answer, and he said no. We had just spent 3 or 4 minutes chatting, and that was 3 or 4 minutes ago, and he did not recall having met me. So people like that, experiences like that, lead to the use of this term memory loss. or people fail to recall where they put this or that object. And then they accuse someone else of having stolen that object. So memory loss is frequently used to describe these kinds of problems, as well as others displayed by people with dementia. But is this a correct description? Is memory loss a correct description? And why is this question important? Well, let's explore this a bit. The question is important for a number of reasons. One is that if people assume that people who have Alzheimer's or dementia have memory loss, they often assume that those people can't make new memories and they won't remember things anyway. So, I'm sure many of you may have heard people say, well, he or she, the person with the diagnosis, won't remember this conversation anyway. It doesn't mean you could say whatever you want, they won't remember it anyway. Therefore, they can't be affected for very long by what happens to them in the here and now, how they're treated by others. Well, they won't remember it anyway. Common courtesy, innocently enough, is often suspended. So a person might talk about the individual with dementia in front of them in a way that they would not speak about them if they thought the person could remember what's going on. We don't, it's like talking behind someone's back, but in front of them. When people have dementia, too often, people will talk behind their back in front of them and say what they wouldn't otherwise say because they figure he or she won't remember it anyway. So common courtesy is often suspended, and people are spoken about in unflattering or disparaging ways. And this is all done innocently. Nobody's trying to hurt anybody. No one ever is trying to hurt anybody here. But the assumption is she won't remember it anyway, so it won't matter if I say these things in front of her. So these things, when you talk about someone like that, it's disparaging, and it really is an assault on a person's self-worth. I mean, if somebody was saying things about you that were hurtful, and that would, why, how dare you talk about me that way in front of other people? That's really not nice. Well, the assumption is I won't remember it, so it's okay. So for these kinds of reasons, it's important to explore whether or not people with Alzheimer's or dementia can make new memories and retrieve old ones, because we may have failed to appreciate some important facts about what is often preserved in the memory abilities of people with Alzheimer's or different kinds of dementia. I mean, this is a really key point. Remember that, let's put this again in perspective. If you think someone has memory loss, if you think they can't make new memories, you might treat them in ways that you wouldn't otherwise treat them. And so it's really important that we understand exactly what kinds of problems people with dementia have with their memories, because maybe they don't have memory loss at all. So in order to explore this, we have to think through some stages of memory. And this is kind of basic stuff about stages of memory. The first stage of memory is called encoding. And so that's what happens is somehow sights and sounds and smells and all the things that going on around us come into us through our senses. And those sights and sounds and smells get translated into all kinds of activity in our nervous system, from our eyes and ears and nose and skin. And all of that neurological activity is sent to the brain, where there are cells that react to that stuff. And some of that stuff becomes memorable for shorter or longer periods of time. Now, there are different kinds of storage, and this is really key. So there are different levels of storage in memory. So there's something called working memory, which is short-term, and then there's long-term memory. So let's just go through the short-term memory part for a second. Now, most of you have had this experience, I bet, and you may actually start laughing when I say this. Okay, you're in one room in your house. Maybe it's upstairs, or it's the upstairs bathroom or bedroom, or it's the bedroom on the other end of the house. And you're doing something, and you say something to yourself, you say to yourself, I've got to go to the kitchen and do this, that, or the other thing. But you're thinking, I've got to go to the kitchen and check on whether or not I've taken something out of the freezer to defrost for dinner tonight. So you think that, and you're still in that other room in the house, and you go about doing some other things. And then you finally go to the kitchen, and you get into the kitchen, and then you look around, you say, okay, why am I here? And for a period of time, you're not recalling what it was you wanted to do in the kitchen. So this is short-term memory, working memory. And here you go in the kitchen, and you're saying, okay, why am I here? And you start looking around and trying to think, and suddenly, bingo, you recall why it was you went into the kitchen in the first place. So short-term memory can last for a very short time. And right now you're using working memory to listen to what I'm saying. So each of these words I'm saying is kind of sitting with you so that they make sense in the sentences I'm speaking. And you probably won't be able to recall all the words that I've spoken 10 minutes from now. You won't be able to repeat word for word what I said, but that's really not important for our purposes. Then there's long-term memory. Somehow, and we don't really know exactly how this works, but somehow some things that are in our short-term memory become very, very memorable and last for a long time. So if I asked you, I could ask you a question about, what's the first telephone number you remember having? Or what was your mother's name before she married your father? What was her last name? I mean, those are kinds of things that you might recall. But you haven't thought about those things recently. So there are things that my grandmother, for example, would tell me stories about things that happened with her 50 years when she was 50 years younger. But she hadn't been really necessarily thinking about those things in decades, but she could recall what happened and when. And so long-term memory can last a really long time. Now, here we come to the real crux of all of this, and it's called the retrieval stage of memory. And this is really, really important when we start to think about whether or not people with dementia have memory loss. And so let's start looking at retrieval and the different kinds of retrieval so we understand how this all works. So there are different kinds of retrieval. One type is called explicit. It's the explicit type. This is what we could say is conscious recall or recognition. So for example, in these kinds of situations, there's one and only one correct answer to a question, like what did you have for breakfast? Or what is your birthday? Or what city were you born in? There's one and only one correct answer to those things. Now, recall is one way to retrieve information from memory. And it's the most difficult. If maybe you recall taking a test in school, and maybe there's a fill in the blank type of test. You have to recall the word that goes into the blank, or it was an essay and you have to recall the information that goes into answering the question. That's the most difficult type of retrieval, and it gets more difficult as we get older. So there are times, I'm known to have, my wife will always look at me in amazement that I have all kinds of information in my mind, like a jingle for a commercial that hasn't been on television since 1960. But there are things that I can recall, but there are other things I used to be able to recall like this, but I can't do it now. And it'll take me a little longer to get there. Maybe I'll wake up in the middle of the night and say, oh, that's what it was. So anyway, recalling information can be more and more difficult as we get older. And obviously, when we have a problem that causes dementia, then recall becomes even really more difficult. Another type of explicit retrieval is called recognition. This is kind of like a multiple choice test. So let me give you an example of how there could be a real difference between those two. When I was testing people in Johns Hopkins Hospital, among the questions that they had to answer was, what day of the week is this? And so I recall asking that question many, many times, and people with dementia would say, I don't know. What day of the week is this? I don't know. And so I had to give them a mark that on the test, 0 for that question, because they say they don't know. But then, just because I was curious, I turned it into a multiple choice question. And I said, well, is it Saturday? No. Is it Monday? No. Is it Thursday? Yes. And it was Thursday. So they recognized the correct answer when they heard it, but they couldn't recall that information without the cue. Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? Recognition memory retrieval is a lot easier than recall. And it happened over and over and over again. People could tell me what day of the week it was when I gave them a few choices, but couldn't do it when I said just, what day of the week is this? So those are two types of retrieval. And a lot of the time, and this is really important, many, many, many times, we will say, I don't remember, when we actually mean, I don't recall. So, because sometimes we'll say, well, how did we get on this subject? Well, we were talking, I don't know how we got on this. Well, we were talking about this and this, and oh, yes. So, you ever listen to the politicians when they're being asked questions by some panel, and they'll ask the politician, what happened? What did you say to someone? Did someone say this to you on such a, I don't recall. They always say, I don't recall. They never say, I don't remember, because recall is only one way to retrieve information from memory. Recognition is another. And now there's another kind of retrieval that we really need to think about, and that's called the implicit type. Now, this is a case. Now, the textbook definition of this is on your screen, and that is a change in behavior due to an experience that a person may not recall having had. So somebody has an experience, and it affects them later, but they don't recall having the experience that is now affecting them. So I will give you some examples of this, so you'll really get the idea, but I will give you sort of laboratory example first, and then a sort of a much more everyday life kind of situation second. So experimentally, there's a kind of experiment called a word stem completion test. So in this task, a person is seated in front of a computer screen and is shown a list of words, and is asked to study the list of words. So you've got 20 words, and you've got to study that list, because you'll be asked some questions about it later. Now, what is going to happen is the person studies the list for a period of time, and then does something else for a short period of time, and then is shown what's called a word stem. And there's an example of it, the DEF with the blank after it. The DEF is a word stem. That's the beginning of a word. And so a person will then be shown a word stem and asked, fill in the blank so as to make a word that you saw on the screen before, on the list that you studied. Now, people with dementia, if you say, fill in the blank to make a word that you saw on the list before, many people with dementia will say, what list? They don't recall having seen a list of words and studied it. So they don't recall that. But do they know it? Has that studying of the list made an impression on them? Well, you don't know from that example, because it's saying what list. So, well, they don't remember. They have memory loss. They don't remember having seen a list of words before and studied. But instead of saying complete that, fill in the blank to make a word you saw on the list you studied, instead of saying that, if you say, fill in that blank to make the first word that comes to your mind, they fill it in correctly. And in this case, they fill in with END to make the word defend, but these lists are made up so that defend is not the only word that could be made by filling in that blank. Deference, defensive. There is a whole bunch of words that start with DEF. And so it's not just a lucky guess. So if you say, take a guess, or with the first word that comes to your mind, they get it. Now, what's the difference between saying, fill in the blank with a word you saw on the list before? Well, there's only one correct answer to that. And you're asking a person to recall that information. And then they say, oh God, what list? Oh my God, But if you say, fill in that blank to make the first word that comes to your mind, well, you can't be wrong about the first word that comes to your mind. I mean, you can't be wrong about that. So there's no pressure in this situation to answer a question like that. But they answer it correctly, which means that they've made a memory of the words on that list, even though they don't recall having seen that list. If I asked you to spell the word read, I just want you to think about how you would spell read. And most of you who are listening to this, I'm not going to say all of you because I would never want to assume that I know what everybody is doing. But most of you, when I say, would you please spell the word read, most of you would spell it R-E-A-D, as in reading. That's the most common use spelling of the word. But as you'll see in this next sentence here, you could also spell the word R-E-E-D, which is a part of a musical instrument, for example. So this is a kind of a test called homophone spelling, two words that sound the same, but they're spelled differently. Now, let's look at an example of how this kind of spelling can reveal a person's memory of an event that he doesn't recall having had. All right. So in this case, and this is not something that this is not Clive Wearing is a person whom I had not dealt with at all, but I know of his case. He had a severe case of encephalitis, and he was someone who was an authority on medieval choral music, and he led a chorus, a choral group. But then he came down with this encephalitis, and it really had a tremendously negative effect on his memory abilities. And so he's in hospital, and this is in a film that you see, and he's in a hospital, and he has a real problem. The memory problem he has is not with his long-term memory going back in time. That's not a problem. He can retrieve information from his memory going back before the encephalitis. But after the encephalitis, he's having problems with his memory. So he gets up in the morning one day, and he's in the hospital room, and he has a journal that he's keeping, and he writes in his journal, it is 8:30 a.m. I am conscious for the first time today. I am alive. He writes that in his journal. It is 8:30 a.m. I am conscious for the first time today. I am alive. A couple of hours later, his wife comes to visit, and she comes into his room, and he recognizes her immediately. Oh, darling, I'm so happy to see you. I'm conscious for the first time today. Now, he says that to her, but then she happens to glance down at where his journal is, and she sees that 3 hours earlier, he wrote, it is 8:30 a.m. I am conscious for the first time today. And so she says to him, but darling, a few hours ago, you wrote that you were conscious for the first time today. And he looks at it. Now, this gets pretty scary, because here is this man who's looking at what he recognizes his writing. And he sees that he wrote, it is 8:30 a.m. I am conscious for the first time today. And now it's 3 hours later, and he's saying, I'm conscious for the first time today. He doesn't recall having written those words 3 hours earlier. He's not recalling that at all. And he gets really upset. This is very scary. He says, "Use your reason, woman. I'm conscious for I'm conscious for the first time today." And he's really scared because you think how you would feel. You wrote, your own handwriting, and you wrote this down, but you don't recall ever having written that at all. And this is some Twilight Zone experience. Like, what the hell is going on here? So, given a person in that kind of condition, now I'm going to give you a hypothetical, and it really does work out. If I were to walk into his hospital room, introduce myself, if I started having a conversation with Clive Wearing about musical instruments, there are different classes of musical instruments. For example, there are percussion instruments, there are woodwind instruments, there are string instruments, and then there are reed instruments. A bassoon or an oboe, those are reed instruments. And if you go to the symphony and you're watching the people play their different instruments, oftentimes when the bassoonist or the oboist isn't playing, you'll see that person pull the reed out from the instrument and blow in it, clear out the saliva, wipe it off, and put it back. The reed vibrates. When they blow into it, the reed vibrates, and it helps make the sound that the instrument makes. So we start talking. If I were to start talking with Clive Wearing about reed instruments, the oboe or the bassoon, I remember a history music class I took when I was in college. And whenever we would listen to a symphony, the professor, whenever there was an oboe, he would hold his nose like that because that's a kind of sound. It was a very kind of nasally sound. In any event, I learned how to listen for an oboe. But anyway, those are reed instruments. Now, if I had that conversation with Clive Wearing, and then I saw someone was motioning to me from the hall, and I had to go outside for a moment, I had to excuse myself from him. I said, "Excuse me, please, I need to go out in the hall. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. I'll be right back." I go out into the hall for a couple of minutes, talk to that person, and then come back into the room. If I then say to Clive Wearing, "Okay, now what were we talking about?" He could look at me and would look at me and say, "I've never met you before in my life. What are you talking about? We've never met." And that's his experience. We just had a conversation. I walked out for a few minutes. He has no recall of having met me, never mind what we were talking about. At that point, if I said to Clive Wearing, "Would you please spell reed for me? Do me a favor, spell reed," he would say REED. And that is an example of implicit retrieval. That is, he has been affected by the conversation we had about reed instruments, so that when asked to spell reed, he spells it according to the least frequent spelling of the word that has to do with what we were talking about that he doesn't recall at all. Follow? Well, now, if we can take that information, and now I'm going to give you examples, cases of people with Alzheimer's disease and how their memory works. So the first example is Mrs. D and meeting at the church. Now Mrs. D was a member of a support group that I was co-leading. And she was a really great person. She had been a middle school teacher for years in New York City. And I mean, I think any teachers are heroes. Anybody who goes into classroom and spends all that time with young people is remarkable. I mean, these are people who should be venerated, especially if they're good. And Mrs. D was one of these great people. And she had Alzheimer's, and so she was in a support group, and she had some memory problems and some other kinds of problems as well. And I wanted to get together with her outside of the group because I wanted to interview her. And so I told her that, and she gave me her phone number. And so I phoned her and wanted to set up a time with her to meet. And so I phoned her, and we were having a nice conversation. And I said, well, how about if we meet tomorrow at 10 o'clock at the church? The church is where the support group met, and she knew where it was. And she drove there. She was still driving. And she said, that sounds great. And we continued talking about something else. And a little while later, she says, okay, so don't you think we should decide where we're going to meet? And I said, no. She obviously does not recall that we had talked about this and agreed to a time and place. But she's asking me anyway, where and when are we going to meet? And so I answered the question as if it were the first time. How about 10 o'clock at the church? She said, great. We continued talking about something else. And a few minutes later, she says, well, so don't you think we ought to figure out where? And I said, yes, I think that's a really good idea. How about 10 o'clock tomorrow at the church? And she said, okay, that's great. I can do that. And this went on 6 times. Every time she asked that question, I answered it as if it were the first time. Now, is that easy to do? Well, yes and no. If it were my mother or my wife or my sister or my father or any loved one, it might not be that easy to do, because this is someone I love. And I really don't want to see that someone, especially if it's a parent or a spouse, I don't want to see that someone failing in some way and showing signs of decline. And it hurts to see it. And so it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do to say, to answer the question as if it were the first time, because you want to say, well, I just told you that. And don't you remember I just told you that a few minutes ago? What all of the emotion in there is much more about, I don't want to see you declining, and it scares me and it hurts me and I don't like it. But what happens very often is we get upset with the person rather than screaming to the heavens maybe and saying, this is not fair. I don't want to see this. This shouldn't be happening to this person. Instead of doing that, we start, I just told you 10 minutes, I told you, which doesn't help anybody. Now, getting back to the story. So Mrs. D 6 times, and I answer it as if it were the first time, because I had no similar emotional connection with her. So I could just do that. What I'm suggesting is it's really a good thing to do that even if you have an emotional connection, even though it's more difficult. Practice makes perfect. We're close to it. So she asked me the 7th time, so what time are we going to meet? And I said, take a guess. And she said 10. And I said, that's right. Now, if I said to her, what time did I tell you? Inside her is, oh my God, he told me. I don't, oh my God, what am I going to do? This is crazy. I don't remember. Because there's one and only one correct answer. And I say, well, what did I tell you? But instead of saying, what did I tell you? I said, take a guess. There's no pressure when you say, take a guess. And she guessed correctly. Now, she didn't quite guess correctly is my point here, because let's just assume that there were 12 daylight hours in the day. And let's assume further that we decided to meet on the hour. She had a 1 in 12 chance of being correct by guessing. 1 in 12. But who said we're going to meet on the hour? Maybe we're going to meet on the quarter hour or the half hour or the 3/4 hour. The odds against her guessing correctly were astronomical. She didn't quite guess. She made a memory, but she couldn't get access to it. And so the only way she could retrieve it was when there was no pressure. And I didn't say, well, what did I tell you? I said, take a guess. No pressure at all. And she guessed. She had it. She made a memory. Another example, Mrs. E at the Adult Day Center. And this is in relation to a 3-stage command and helping at lunch. Mrs. E was a lovely person, had Alzheimer's disease. So did Mrs. D in the example above. So Mrs. E was a really lovely person, very outgoing and engaging, had a great sense of humor, and she knew who I was in the sense that she recognized me when she saw me. But I would chat with her from time to time, and we had a really nice time together. One of the items on a standard test in the hospital clinic is something called a 3-stage command. And that means that what that's translated into is you say to someone, take this piece of paper, fold it in half, and put it on the floor. 3 things. Take the piece of paper, fold it in half, put it on the floor. Now, in a testing situation, she couldn't do that. I mean, she would take it and then she would do something and hand it back to me. She couldn't do the 3-stage command. So one day, as lunch was coming to an end and volunteers and staff are helping clear the tables, I said to Mrs. E, she was walking toward me, and I said, Mrs. E, can you do me a favor? And she perked up. I mean, she just immediately kind of lit up and smiled. Oh, sure. This is really important because how often is a person asked, and a person with dementia at a day center, asked to do a favor for someone? Now, it's usually they're the ones who are receiving all of the help, but now I'm asking her to do something for me, which is a really important thing because a lot of us like to give. We like to do things. We like to feel like we have purpose and we can do things, and it's nice to be asked. So can you do me a favor? She says, sure. I said, would you go over to Frank? Frank was one of the other participants who was sitting there. Would you go over to Frank, pick up his tray, and empty it in the trash, please? That's a 3-stage command. Go over to Frank, pick up his tray, and empty it in the trash, please. She did it. Boom. She couldn't do it the typical 3-stage command, but in a social situation where I asked her to do me a favor, she could. And she did. Great, great. 2 days later, which was the first time I had returned to the center, now it's after the lunch is coming to an end again, and she comes over to me. I didn't say a word to her. She came over to me of her own volition, and she said, do you have something for me to do? And I said, like what? And she said, I don't know. Now, I had been there often. I'm there, and she never, ever came to me after lunch and asked, do you have something for me to do? Until that day, which was 2 days after I asked her to do me a favor. So she made a memory of me asking her to do me a favor. She couldn't recall what it was, but she did remember that I had asked her to do something. She made a memory of that. It was a positive thing, and she made a memory of it, even though she couldn't recall what it was. Another example, Mr. D and the lawnmower. Mr. D was retired. He had Alzheimer's, but he still did all of the landscaping around the house. He mowed the lawn, he trimmed the shrubs, and he really took pride in that. It was something that he enjoyed. His wife was nervous about him using the lawnmower. She was concerned that he was going to have an accident with it. There was nothing that happened, but she was nonetheless concerned that he would have an accident or break something. And so she put a lock on the door of the shed in the back of the house where all of the gardening equipment was kept. And one day the grass needed cutting, and Mr. D went out there, and there was a lock on the door. And so he took a cinder block and broke the lock off, opened the door, took out the lawnmower, and cut the grass. His wife became even more upset, and so she phoned their eldest child, John. Now, they had 3 adult children who lived in the area, and she called John, the oldest, and had John come over, and she explained to John that she was afraid that his dad was going to hurt himself using the lawnmower. And so she asked John if John would take the lawnmower to his house so there won't be any incident with the lawnmower and his father. John agrees and takes the lawnmower away. This is all unbeknownst to Mr. D. He is not included in this conversation. He has no idea that it took place. He doesn't know that the lawnmower is no longer there. but now the grass needs cutting again. And he goes out to the shed and the lawnmower is gone. And so he reports to his wife that he thinks someone stole the lawnmower, at which point she says to him, no, actually, I gave it to John to take to his house because I'm afraid that you're going to hurt yourself or do some damage or something like that. 5 days later, the three children come for Sunday dinner. The youngest arrives first, and Mr. D gives the youngest hugs and kisses. The middle one arrives next, and Mr. D gives the middle one hugs and kisses. John arrives, and Mr. D won't look at him and won't talk to him. It's never happened before. This is the first time that's ever happened. Mrs. D says, are you angry with John? Mr. D says, yeah. And she says, why? And he says, I don't know. He cannot recall the reason, the incident that took place, but he made a memory of something negative relating to John and him, and that he was very angry about it. And he had every reason to be angry because he was disenfranchised. He wasn't included in this conversation. This was done behind his back. John and his wife conspired to take this job away from him that he really loved. And how dare you do that to me? How can you do that? Why would you treat me this way? So this is a very unpleasant thing. Now, if you don't know about implicit memory, if you think he has memory loss, that he can't make any new memories, if you think, now let's just do this very carefully. If you think that he can't make new memories, and now he's got Alzheimer's disease, and he's angry with John for reasons nobody understands, it's really a short step to say that Mr. D is irrationally hostile. That's a symptom of dementia, right? Irrational hostility. So that's how he's looked at. But if you know that he can make new memories, if you know that implicit memory is possible, that he could make a memory of something, not recall the details, but nonetheless make a memory, then you look at his anger toward John, not as irrational hostility, but as righteous indignation. And there's a big difference between irrational hostility and righteous indignation. If you're angry with me and I don't understand why you're angry with me, you're not irrational. I'm confused. You're not irrational because I don't understand why you're angry. You're not irrational. So, but if I have good reason to be angry about something, and that you know I would be angry about this if I could make a memory, then you wouldn't treat me that way. Or at least you would talk to me about it first. And you would include me in all of this because this could be really, really important. So Mr. D made a memory and it stayed with him for 5 days. He couldn't recall the details. Dr. B at the Adult Day Center, a room for meeting. Now, Dr. B and I met twice a week at the Adult Day Center for conversation. And we used a particular room at the day center each time. It was the same room. It was an empty room that was not being used at the moment, and we could spend an hour or two there. Now, one day, there was something going on that with the staff, we couldn't use that room. So we went down the hall to a different room, and we used that room for the first time. And it was fine. That was a Thursday. The next time I saw Dr. B was a Tuesday, the next Tuesday. When I got to the day center, the staff was telling me, oh, we just had some real commotion here with Dr. B. Oh, yeah, this was a very distinguished kind of man. He is not the kind of person who had a hair trigger temper or anything like that. But apparently he had made a fuss, which was very unlike him. So it turns out that he knew I was coming, and so he went down the hall to the room that we used the last time, which was not the room we always used, right? This is the room that we used for the first time on the previous Thursday. He went down there and he saw some staff people in there, and he tried to throw them out of the room. He was telling them they had to get out because he had a meeting. Now, they were totally confused because they had no idea who he was or why he was telling them that. He made a memory of us using that room and held onto it for 5 days. I asked him about that. I said, that was pretty amazing. You made a memory of that. How do you explain it? And he said, it was damn important to me. Now, that's another piece of this puzzle. Making memories, it matters how, and with Mr. D in the lawnmower as well, and Mrs. D in the church meeting, I mean, if something is really important to someone, it has a different, oh, shall we say, degree of meaningfulness. And so there are other things that really don't matter. So if you said to somebody, what'd you have for breakfast today? Well, I mean, who cares? I mean, that doesn't really matter. But this is something really important, and it's positive or it's negative. Now we're entering into a different world of memory making. And you all know it too, because whenever there's an emotion attached to something, it's much more memorable. Where were you on 9/11? Boom. You'll tell me all kinds of stuff about 9/11. The other part of Dr. B is he went to a nursing home later on, and in the nursing home, at some doorways there was a little riser, and so when he would be walking out into the hall from the room, he would trip. He wouldn't fall, but he would just sort of stumble on that riser. Now, if he couldn't make any memories at all, he would keep doing that over and over and over again, but he didn't. After that happened a few times, he started lifting his foot up a lot higher off the ground. So he made a memory of that. Why'd you do that? I don't know. But he learned. Now, in order to learn, you have to have memory. Next example is, and this is a very stark one, and this is the Muslim woman in a nursing home. Now, this is a lady who had been widowed 10 years earlier. And the way she practiced her religion was, after her husband died, not only did she not have any kind of intimate relations with any man, she never even dated another man. That was it. And she was going to live her life widowed, and that was it. Well, she's now in a nursing home, and the place where she's living is, there are multiple hallways where the rooms were, and they were all painted the same color. So, you couldn't really distinguish that, oh, I'm in the red hall or the blue hall, the yellow. And she had a tendency of getting up in the middle of the night and walking around. And because she had a tendency to get up in the middle of the night and walk around, it was noted in the nurses and staff's chart for her that she should be checked up on every 5 to 10 minutes. Well, one night she gets up and is walking around, and she goes down the wrong hallway, heading back toward what she thought was her room. But she happens to go into the room of another resident who was a much younger man who had a history of sexual aggression, and the man raped her. And she's screaming, and all the screaming went on, and the staff came and found what was going on. Well, she didn't want the staff to tell her son, because this was just an incredible humiliation and embarrassment to her. But they had to tell her son, her adult son. And they did. And then it turned out that the son brought a lawsuit against the nursing home for negligence, because they didn't check up on her that night as they were supposed to. And the thing about this is that in the aftermath, every now and then, this woman would just start crying for no apparent reason. There was nothing going on, and she would just start crying. And she would say something that related to that man, but she couldn't recall exactly what it was. This case comes to court, and the attorneys defending the nursing home argued that the case should be dismissed as frivolous. Not that rape is frivolous, but that it should be dismissed as frivolous because the woman had Alzheimer's disease, and she had memory loss, And she won't remember this anyway. And so there will be no lasting harm to her. Now, obviously, these attorneys didn't know about implicit memory. And so they thought memory loss means nothing, that you can't make any new memories at all. And that's how they argued. As it turned out, the case was settled out of court. Another example of cueing. General Yu was an amazing person. He was one of those guys who landed on Omaha Beach as a second lieutenant on D-Day and stayed in the Army for 36 years, retired as a brigadier general, and served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And he was one great guy. And I met him on a number of occasions, worked with his wife. And the first time I met him, his wife had invited me for dinner. At dinner was General Yu, their adult daughter, who was a nurse and visiting from out of town, and Mrs. Yu. Mrs. Yu made a wonderful baked salmon and vegetables and salad. It was delicious. And we had a really lovely conversation around dinner. And the two ladies get up and they're clearing the table. And I'm sitting there with General Yu. And General Yu turns to me at one point and says, "See, I don't even know what I had for dinner." And I said, "Well, I don't know. Let's see about that. Did you have chicken?" And he said, "No, I think it was fish." And I said, "You're exactly right. We had salmon." He turns to his wife and daughter and says, "When's this guy coming back here again?" I knew he could make a memory. The problem with him, as with people with dementia of any kind, is retrieving the memory, getting at it. He couldn't recall, but once given a cue, something to start the ball rolling, and it was really a good dinner, he could answer the question correctly. And I didn't, there was no right or wrong. I mean, there was like, oh, well, was it this? No, I think it was that. And these are all examples. I mean, one other example of this is Mrs. DL being asked my name at the support group. I was explaining the difference between recall and multiple choice recognition, and she wanted me to do that again. The fact that she asked me after a while, "Could you go through that again?" means she had made a memory of what I was saying in the first place. But I said, "Okay, well, what's my name?" I had introduced myself, and she said, "I don't remember." She started saying, "I don't remember," and then she said, "I don't recall," which is another bright spot there, right? So then I say, I would give her multiple choice, 4 examples. I gave her one example, again, my name beginning, short, but beginning with an S. And I gave her one example and she said no. I gave her another example, she said no. And she was correct. It wasn't either of those two. Then I said Sabat, and she said, "Let me hold on to that one." And I gave her the 4th one. She said no. The one she said, "Let me hold on to," was the correct answer. So she made a memory of my name, but she couldn't recall. She needed some help to retrieve what was there. And so these are all examples of how people with dementia can make new memories, but they have a recall problem, especially. They might be able to retrieve that information by multiple choice. They might be able to show that they made a memory by the way they act, but it's all important so that we don't use that term. So going to the next summary, let's just summarize where we have been here. First of all, recalling is not the same as remembering, because one can fail to recall, and if one fails to recall, it doesn't mean one fails to remember. Just because you say, "I don't remember," well, you might remember even though you can't recall. One can remember even though one is unable to recall, because one might still be able to recognize the correct answer in multiple choice format. One might still be able to remember because implicit memory still functions. What the person does, Mr. D getting angry with John in particular, Mrs. D in the meeting at the church, take a guess. Oh, 10, yep, there you go. So because there are these possibilities of retrieving from memory, even though recall doesn't work, The term memory loss is not an accurate descriptor of people with Alzheimer's or other kinds of dementia. It's really an explicit memory. It's a recall dysfunction mainly. It doesn't mean loss. It means it's not functioning the right way. So the way it used to. So to lose memory is an entirely different meaning. So, and to get back to the importance of all of this, how would we treat someone if we thought they couldn't remember anything? How would we treat someone if they could remember things that were important to them? Would there be a difference in the way we treated people? Keeping that in mind, some recommendations. Treat people with common courtesy. Know that they can make new memories and act on the basis of those memories. Make good moments on the basis of this. A person may not be able to recall, but make good moments. After all, think about it. What do we have in this life? We have a bunch of moments, and we never know how many moments we're going to have. I'll give you an example. On July 24th, 2006, I was speaking with my dad on the phone. He lived 260 miles from me. I was speaking with my dad on the phone, as I did every night for decades. Always phoned him at the same time. He was living in his cottage in New Jersey and with my mom, and she had died 8 years before this. And he was living independently. He had macular degeneration. His vision was bad. He could still see, but not really well. But he also had a colon cancer. And he was 2 weeks past his 96th birthday. And he was still living in his home where he loved. He loved it. And so that night, we said, when we were getting off the phone, I said to him, as I said every night, I said, "I love you, Dad." And he said, "I love you dearly, Steve." And that's how we ended our conversation, as we did every night. It turned out, unbeknownst to me at that moment, that that was the last conversation. I didn't know that that was going to be the last conversation, but it was. When I think about that, when I thought about it after the immediate aftermath, and when I think about it now, I'm just so happy that the last words we shared were, "I love you." And that's, I smile in my heart when I think about that. Make a good moment. You never know when it's going to be the last moment. And so let's make this one a good one. I know it's really difficult to do because we get caught up in everyday life and we get caught up in situations and moments, and we have to learn. It's not easy. I'm not perfect by any means. You can ask my wife, she'll tell you. But it's a really good goal to pursue and a goal to try to achieve. Don't put people in a position to fail. Don't ask people, what did you have for breakfast? What's today's date? What did you have for breakfast? Yeah, asking people questions about the things that are inconsequential. I mean, and the reason why people say, "What did you have for breakfast?" or "What's today? What day of the week is this?" is because the person asking the question will feel better if the person being asked answers it correctly. Now, but this stuff is really unimportant in the end. You know, you go on vacation, do you know what day it is? Well, usually not. You have to look at your calendar, you look at your phone or something, you know, but you have to make sure you know what day it is when you have to leave. But don't put people in a position to fail. I mean, this is something that's not rocket science. Why would you put someone in a position to fail about something that is meaningless in the end? So more recommendations. Assume that what you say and do can affect a person with dementia, that they can make new memories, even if shown only implicitly. So assume that new memories can be made. If a person repeats previously asked and answered questions, don't say, "I just told you that," or "What did I just tell you?" because they're not recalling that fact. So saying, what did I tell you a minute ago? That's not helpful, because if they could recall it, they wouldn't be asking, why would I ask you this question if I could recall what you told me, or that I even asked that question of you? Instead, say, take a guess. Try to maintain a non-anxious presence. People can get very sensitive to heightened anxiety, and that makes it more difficult to retrieve information from memory. Yeah, remember that people diagnosed with dementia can be very upset about recall problems, and maybe try to cover them up. And trying to cover up your problems is a kind of a sign of mental health, because that the person has self-respect. Why would anybody want to be seen in a bad light? None of us does. People with dementia are no different. Remember that having self-respect is more important than knowing what day of the week it is, or what we had for breakfast. And remember that Maya Angelou was correct. People will forget what you said, but they'll always never forget how you made them feel. And people with dementia are still people who deserve common courtesy and a sense of belonging and togetherness. And so if we assume that people can make memories, we treat them accordingly, and everyone could be rendered happier that way. And this is a book I wrote with you all in mind. It's a book about, the subtitle is What Everyone Needs to Know. And it's really important stuff in there. And I wrote it with your minds in mind. So it's for everyday people. And because the professionals already know about this stuff, they don't need to be reminded. I've already done that with them, but this is something I've done with you. So I'm really pleased to be able to have spent this time with you, and hope that it's been helpful to you, and that you'll remember in one way or another what I've told you, and you can revisit this and look at it again and again if you like. Thanks to Daphne and Chris Eccles, who have together made this so that it can be on YouTube and you can see it repeatedly.
I feel like we just had the most realistic lecture just given to us that we could absorb, because all those examples, those real life examples, that's what attracted me to Dr. Sabat. Things that we could understand, things that we can think of our neighbors, our relatives, our loved ones. They know. And there's so many times we look past them, but Dr. Sabat's the one that actually put it into words. So I'm just thrilled that he could share this with us. We've got a couple of minutes left. Does anybody have any questions you would like to ask him? Chris, can you go ahead and throw up a slide of his book one more time? I know he had it, but I know you've got a bigger version. One question I have coming in is, do you have any experience with aphasia? I have a loved one with aphasia, and it makes her memories seem jumbled, but I know that she is in there.
Okay, so there are two different kinds of aphasia. One is receptive aphasia, meaning that the person can't understand the spoken word or read, and another kind is expressive. So you could have one type of aphasia where we can't say a lot, and it's difficult to speak at all. Another kind of aphasia, called Wernicke's aphasia, is a situation where a person speaks but can jumble up the sounds of letters and jumble up words in certain ways that it doesn't really sound like it's making a lot of sense. But what you ought to do, I mean, in a case like this, is if a person's doing that, it's always a good way of getting at this is saying, are you trying to tell me this? Are you trying to tell me that? Make yourself vulnerable. Say, look, I'm having trouble understanding what you're trying to tell me. And if you could show me, there was a woman at the day center who had a problem like that, and she could speak and she could say lots of words, but it was difficult for her to kind of put the words in order. But she, instead of saying that one of the staff members bothered her for this or this reason, she would just imitate the attitude that she thought the person had, very haughty and bossy. And
That's scary.
So, you can ask your loved one, tell, I'm having trouble understanding what you're saying. So if you can show me, or if you can, and you cue in on the emotion. And so, for example, there was a guy at the day center who had Alzheimer's, and he was apparently, I mean, he was going, I never met him before. He was going on and on and on and on and on. A lot of words, but I couldn't figure out exactly what those words meant when you put them together. But he was just really going on. And at one point I got a word in and I said, "Do you feel like crying?" And the guy said, "You're damn right I do." And that was the first coherent sentence he spoke. So key in on the emotion. Do you feel this way? Do you feel?
Key in on the emotion. I think that's what we all need to remember. That's key in on the emotion. I'm going to take one more question. This is great. The phrase "take a guess"
Oh,
is
yeah.
a great tool to help us when we answer our loved ones that are repeating over and over. Are there any other phrases you would suggest us to use?
Um, how do you feel? What do you think? Or, I mean, oh, that's a part of the emotion stuff. How do you feel? Or what do you think? Um, you kind of sort of open things up. So again, you're trying to make it so that the person can't be wrong. It's kind of like asking, if I said to you, "What's your favorite flavor of ice cream?" And you said chocolate. And if I said, "No, it isn't," you'd laugh at me and say, "That's ridiculous," because you can't be wrong about your favorite flavor. So you put people in a position where they feel freer to just say what's on their mind. And usually it's going to be in line with what's been going on. And so, but putting it to asking people to recall directly, that's just asking for trouble. That's sort of leading with your chin, you're putting somebody in a really bad position.
That's right. That's right. One last one. It's so difficult when they're confused. How do you deal with it when they are not in the present?
Oh, well, the first question I have is how do you know they're not in the present? But let's just say, here's a thing, and I think that this might be helpful. There's a difference between psychological time and linear time. So we think in time, it's kind of like this is today, that was yesterday, tomorrow is tomorrow, next summer is the future, and 10 years ago is the past, this is now. And that's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's kind of true, but psychological time doesn't necessarily work that way. So for instance, you can bring something in your past into the present moment. That's why psychologists call it the personal present. So, for example, I've done this. Has happened with me. I've done it. It's really hysterical. I was telling someone about an interaction I had with a former colleague who was quite the bully, and this is a person who was very overbearing and a real bully, and hurt people and insulted them. But he kind of was in a superior position, so people were really afraid to say anything because he could do things that would hurt them professionally. So one day he needed a lift home. Where he was staying was close to where I lived, and I was going to drive him, and I got him in my car. And I reamed him a new one, man. I laid into him something fierce in that car, and he ran out of the car when he got to his place. But the point is that many years later, I was describing that incident to a friend. Many years later, I was describing this incident to a friend, and I was in it as if it were then. I was talking, and this friend of mine was in the car. I was driving, and this friend of mine's in the car, and I was talking as the way I did at that moment. And this friend of mine, as we were driving, as when I finished, we're driving away, we had been at a traffic light. She was saying that the people in the car next to us thought I was screaming at her. And they were like, "What is going on there?" But the point I'm trying to make is the way I was feeling now was exactly the way I was feeling then. I brought this from the past into my personal present. So people can be getting to your point, people could be having thoughts about another time in their life when something or other happened. It occurs to you this time during the war or this whenever, but they're not able to say things like, I was just thinking about this time during the war when. It's just, they're there. They're living it again, but they're not prefacing it with, as if they're
not giving it an introduction.
Yeah. And so I don't know if they're confused. It might be confusing to you, the listener, like, what the hell's going on here? Because that was then, this is now. But for that person, then is right now because they're reliving it.
That's great. That is great. Well, Doc, I'm going to cut it off here, but I have a feeling this won't be the last of our webinars with you. And I hope we have him down to the Southland when COVID is over sometime soon. But this has been so just thought-provoking, and we appreciate you being with us. And for anybody listening, it'll be replayed on YouTube forever and ever, so you can find it under the Respite Ministry.
Well, I thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you, guys. Goodbye.
Bye.